Today we'll be doing the absolute basics of Adobe Illustrator. Currently I'm on an older Mac with an older version of Illustrator. This is Illustrator CS 5.1. Most of you out there will be using Creative Cloud, which is quite a few versions newer. So do realize that some of this will look a little different. But the functionality of the tools will stay the same. You'll actually just have extra stuff on top. If you have trouble with this, please feel free to email me. But let's go ahead and get started. Please realize that Illustrator, I already have it open, so it'll open a little bit slower for you. These are big programs, so even if you have a relatively fast computer, it's not going to be. It could possibly be frustrating to use these if they outpace what your computer can do. Again, this is an older version, so these edges are going to look different. One of the big things that's going to look different is the new one is automatically in dark mode, so it's a darker gray color closer to this for the whole thing. One reason I also like this is that it's going to look a little bit better on a 1080p display, which is what I'm recording in right now. Alright, so Illustrator, first things first. File, New. You'll have a screen that looks like this. Of course, things are going to be rearranged because, again, different versions. I am going to call this one Day 1 Practice. Number of artboards, 1. For the purposes of this class, we'll be using 1 artboard for at least the first half of the semester. Letter is 8.5 by 11 inches. That's a standard piece of printer paper that we are used to. We're not going to do any bleeds, mainly because most printers can't do bleeds, and so we're just not going to mess with it for purposes of this class. Units, make sure this is in inches. Oftentimes this is automatically set to points, and points are not a unit that we're used to using. Points are 1/72nd of an inch, so there's 72 points in an inch. There are actually 12 points in a pica and 6 pica in an inch, and so that is that system. We don't use that. We're just going to use inches. You could also use millimeters and centimeters, but in the US it'll give you strange measurements for things. And pixels doesn't work because, at least for the purposes of this class, we'll be using Illustrator for printing. So we might as well just go ahead and use the dimensions we're used to. We're going to use inches. Orientation is irrelevant. It just depends on what you're designing that day. I'm going to leave mine right side up. Hit OK. You have your new document. It's made a new document. You can immediately hit Command S and save that document. It will save out as a .ai file. I'm going to save mine on my desktop because I'm a bad person. And I'll save it as Day 1 Practice. Go ahead and do this just immediately. Anytime you work on a file, first thing you should do, go ahead and save that file. Yep, I'm going to leave all this alone. Now, every time I hit Command S, it will just save. I don't have to worry about renaming it or anything like that, and I can just tap Command S. If you're on a PC, please realize this will be Control S, not Command S. And that goes for anything that I say during this talk. I'll try to remember to say it every once in a while, but if I say Command something, if you're on a PC, you're going to be using Control something. Alrighty, first thing is just navigation. Mouse, like always. To move around without having to do anything special, spacebar. See how my cursor turns into a little hand? I can click with the hand even does a little grab action, and now I can move around. See, I can put this just wherever I like. Now, what if I want to go zoom in or zoom out? Well, I'll hold Command or Control, plus, zooms me in, minus, zooms me out. Alright, now what if I've zoomed way in, and I'm off somewhere, and I'm just completely lost, and I can't get back. Well, all I have to do is hit Command 0. Command 0 brings me back to a point where it fits the page to the screen, it centers it, and it just gets me back where I started. That's the get back to home kind of save thing. And if you notice, your command plus and minus on the keyboard are right next to 0. So when you're hitting command plus and command minus to zoom in and out, it's just the key right next to that to get back to home. Alright. So, plus. Spacebar is our hand again. And minus. And 0. And 0 gets us back to here. Now, I like designing with rulers. Once you're in this for a while, you can design whether or not you like designing with rulers, but we're going to design with rulers. I can hit Command R, and that just gives me my rulers. Command and the letter R just gives me my rulers. If I don't want them, Command R. Now if you look, Command R, it actually overlapped the edge of my page. I can't see all my page anymore. Well, Command 0 fixes that right up. Takes care of that. These will also lock to the page. As I move the page around, the rulers in both axes are going to go with it. If I want to go find it, if I don't want to use Command R, I can go to View, Rulers, Show Rulers. If I show the rulers, then this will change to Hide Rulers. Now if you notice, watch this button. When I hit Command R, it highlighted briefly. Right? I'm going to hit Command R a bunch. See how it's highlighting View? That lets you know, so if you have a command where you know the keyboard command and you don't know where it is in the menus, that will tell you where that is. Now, we have rulers up. We're ready to go. We have our nice page. One thing is, again, I said that the printers that we use really don't have good bleed settings. And bleed just means that the print goes all the way to the edge. We can have it just arbitrarily cut the edges off of our print and leave a white border. However, that white border is going to be both uneven and we'll lose some of our art. We don't want that. So one thing that I always do is I start with 1/2 inch margins. That's pretty big. 1/2 inch margins on every page is pretty big. But the nice thing about that is that it gives you that extra space where the printer can cut into it, and it doesn't take away your art. Also, the printer can actually rotate the page very slightly as it goes through a printer, especially really high-speed older printers. The page can rotate a little bit, and with 1/2 inch margins, that actually hides that entirely. It hides the fact that that rotates in having heavy margins. If you have really tight margins and it rotates 1/2 a degree, it's really, really noticeable. So we're, for the purposes of this class, going to start with 1/2 inch margins on everything. To get what's called a guide is a piece of art that will show up but will not print. It's going to show up on our screen, it's going to be there on our screen, it is not going to print. To get a guide, we go over to the ruler, click and hold, and then we drag out this little dotted line. Now, if I just set this ruler down without touching anything else, it's not on any actual increment. If I hold Shift, it locks it to the ruler. See how now it's bouncing back and forth between the ruler marks? If I don't hold Shift, it lets me just move it however I want. If I do hold Shift, it snaps it. Now, this is 2 inches. This is 1 inch. That is 1/2 inch. If I want to actually see that, I can zoom in, and I can see 0, 1, halfway in between. Now, the end of our page, because letters are 8.5 by 11, is going to get the 1/2 inch margin on 8. I can use my little hand to get up to the top. Do the same thing here, hold Shift. And then I could use the scroll bar if I like. I'm not a huge fan of it, but it works. 1/2 inch margin. Now, again, we're going to look at our whole page, Command 0. gives us our entire page with guides. So now we know if we put art on the outside of these blue lines, that's not great. We want to leave that area white so it looks very clean. Now if you notice, I can click on these and move them. It's no good. If I do that, then I lose it being exactly on the 8, and I don't want that. I want these to stay. So the first thing I'm going to do is just undo that movement. And the way to undo anything in this is to hold the command or control key and then tap Z. Tap Z and it puts it back. Right? Move something you don't like, command Z or control Z. Now, I don't want to do that every time I accidentally move one of these guides, especially if I move the guide. What happens if I move the guide just a little bit and I don't notice it? I can't just hit command Z every time. So what I'm going to do, let's go to View, Guides, Lock Guides. Now look at this. I can't grab them. I cannot click and mess with these. I can actually still make new ones. Let's say I want a middle line in my page. Well, a middle line in my page is going to be at 4 1/4, because 8 1/2 divided by 2 is 4 1/4. That is right there. That is the middle line of my page. But as soon as I drop it, see, it's gone. It's locked. Can't get it back. I can, of course, command Z and get rid of it. Now let's move on to actually making a few objects and getting the remainder of our basic control tools. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here. All of my tools pretty much are going to be in this area. The only thing to note, one thing that just happened, the tooltip. If you just hover over any of these symbols, it will tell you what it is. Sometimes these symbols aren't exactly obvious. For example, the little eraser without pink being its hover color doesn't really look like an eraser. We hover over it, we can see what it is. Some of these things in here, very complicated. We can hover over and see what they are. Now, I just want a rectangle. Rectangle is going to give me the ability to do quite a few things. So I'm going to select that. Now if you notice, I no longer have a black arrow. I have this little crosshair. Crosshair, I can click and drag. It's going to give me a box. And I'm not going to worry about some of the fancy things we can do with shapes quite yet. I just want to get a shape out so I can do some editing. Now, I can go back. That basic tool that we have is called the selection tool. It's this black arrow in the top left-hand corner. What that allows me to do is grab an object and move it. That allows me to scale an object one way. If I don't want to do that, command Z. Allows me to scale an object both directions. Don't want to do that. If I do this, and if I hold Shift, notice it keeps my aspect ratio. Whatever shape it was before, it's just making it bigger or smaller without changing the shape. See, even if I come way over here. If I let off Shift, it's going to fill that. If I hold Shift, it keeps it to its original shape. Command Z. Oh, that returned it way back. Now, another thing, if I'm doing this, I can hold Shift to hold it. I can also hold Option, and Option will scale it around its center point. So instead of going from the bottom left edge in this case to the top right where I'm touching, it will do it from a center point. I can stack these commands, or I can stack these controls by holding Option and Shift. See, Option and Shift both holds the aspect ratio and lets me scale from the center. So let's say this object is the wrong size, but I know where the center is. Well, I can put it on a center point and then just scale it to fit, and I'm good to go. Now, if I click off of this, it disappears. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag a big box around it to collect it again. There it is. I can look over here and see that I have no stroke and no fill. When you're doing this, you may have a stroke or fill already enabled, especially depending on if you're opening a new file after previously using one. First, I'm going to change my fill. Fill is in the back. If I click it once, it will simply move my fill to the foreground. Sometimes it will pop this color guide, sometimes it will not. We don't want to use that. What I want to do is just double click this. I double click this little icon, it brings up this big fancy window, got lots of options in here. I can define an RGB color by numbers. I can define a CMYK color by numbers. It will do the conversion between those. It's not always perfect, but it does its best. We're not going to use these ones. We're only going to use RGB and CMYK for the purposes of this class. Let's say I want mine to be a pink color fill. So I'm just going to choose a pink color fill, and I can see all these numbers have changed to reflect that. One thing to note, if you select this and you take it too far, notice right here there's a little emergency. The emergency means that that color will show up fine on a screen, but it's not going to print well. It's just not going to print well. So what we want to do is only pick colors that are inside of that if our intention is to print. I want pink, so it doesn't matter. I now have a pink square. I can move it around just the same way, but when I click off, right, when I click over here, I can still see where this thing is. Now let's say I want a different color stroke. This controls the edge of the object. The edge of the object. So I'm going to do a nice dark blue, and you can see how quickly that emergency logo comes up when I'm in the blues. I can only really get some dark blues. As soon as I try to get a bright blue, it's not printable. If you want to pick one of these colors and then move back to the closest printable color, you can just click there and it will move you to the closest, mathematically closest, printable color. So we're going to go ahead and do that. Actually, I want it a little darker. Okay. So now when I click away, I have a very fine blue line around this. It's very thin. If I want this thin line to be bigger, what I'm going to do is come up here to stroke. The weight of the stroke is in points. We start at 1 point. That's 1/72 of an inch. It's very, very small. Bump that up a few, let's say 5 points. Now I have a line around this object that I can actually see, even zoomed out like I am right now. If I want a copy of this object, I can hit Command C, Command V, and it will paste a copy of this object. Command C is copy in pretty much any program. Command V is in Victor, is paste in pretty much any program, and it works just the same in Illustrator. If I want a slightly easier way to do that, I can click, drag, hold Option, and when I'm holding Option, see that second arrow show up behind my cursor? That tells me that I'm going to get a copy. So if I hold Option, let go of my mouse button, it throws me a new object without having to do the Command C, Command V, Command C, Command V thing. You can keep doing this. You can just make a bunch of objects if you desire. If you don't want an object, simply select it, tap the Delete key on the keyboard, and they're gone. Now, the black arrow tool, we can see that there are two arrow tools here. One way to think of the black arrow tool is this is just going to control the whole object without letting you modify things within the object. To modify things within the object, we want the white direct selection tool. This is the selection tool, this is the white direct selection tool. To modify things within these, I want to grab this. So, I can now see that this little bounding box has changed. This box has changed. When I hover, I now get tooltips for the edges. I get paths, and I get anchors. Now, anchors control the shape. This is telling Illustrator, I want to point here, and I want to point here, and this path is just literally the path between those 2 points. Now, with the white arrow tool, I can select one of these anchors, move it. This allows me to start to make more complicated shapes while still keeping relatively simple geometry. This works on any of these. If I want to keep the path the same but move the rest of the shape, I can just select in the middle of the path, and that allows me to modify the shape without modifying that one path. If I take an anchor, it again moves that anchor and changes the path to get from anchor 1 to anchor 2, from anchor 2 to anchor 3. So that is what the white arrow tool is for. Very useful tool. I can break my object. I can do damage to it by selecting this, hitting delete. And see, now we have an open object. This is going to cause some problems with a few tools, so we're going to try to not do this for the meantime. We will be doing open objects eventually. So, Command Z to undo that, Control Z. Get the black arrow tool. Now I can move these around just as if they were anything else. So, that's selection tools. That is some of the basic navigation within Illustrator. Again, we need to remember to save our file. File save. Or, as we saw right there, Command S will save our file for us. Command S will save our file. We're now good.